One small mistake in a single week is enough to push a person to their breaking point. And today that breaking point is standing in the middle of Denver Airport, wearing a deep blue polo shirt that looks harmless. No one could guess that the ordinary man they are about to underestimate is someone capable of stopping an entire airline with a single command. Evan Brooks does not look like a chief executive. He carries no luxury leather briefcase, wears no platinum watch, and has no security detail or assistant trailing behind him. Just a 38-year-old man of average height, with calm but bright eyes, and a slow, unhurried stride as if nothing in life could rush him. Yet behind that simplicity is a mind that once steered a company from an old garage into a multi-billion-dollar empire. But this morning, Evan wants one thing only: quiet. A first-class cabin, a window seat, a flight without trouble. He walks into Denver International Airport with footsteps heavy enough to show fatigue, yet light enough to reveal that he still controls his pace of life. Outside dawn has not fully broken the early sunlight, muted by the giant glass panels of the terminal, casting a warm, dim glow over the rushing crowd. The sound of suitcase wheels scraping the floor forms a chaotic symphony. Somewhere a child is crying. Somewhere an airport staff member is calling the names of passengers who are late. And somewhere hurried eyes glide past him, unaware that they are walking by a man who could alter the fate of their company with a single email. Evan likes this feeling, the ordinariness, the anonymity. It frees him from the suffocating weight of the chief executive title. He approaches an automated check-in kiosk, gets his boarding pass, then heads straight for the Northern Sky Airlines lounge. Not because he craves luxury, but because after a long week of work, he just wants a quiet corner to breathe. In the lounge, Evan chooses a seat by the window. Outside aircraft line up like silver arrows waiting to be released into the sky. Everything feels strangely peaceful. He sips his coffee and closes his eyes briefly, letting the warmth spread across his exhausted body. But peace is a luxury, and Evan knows he cannot keep it for long. A gentle vibration in his pocket pulls him back. Boarding in 10 minutes. He stands, adjusts his jacket, tightens the strap of his bag. Nothing remarkable in the movement, yet it carries the quiet decisiveness of someone always prepared for anything. Evan enters the boarding area. The crowd pushes like always. First class still takes longer than necessary, because everyone wants to be the first to step onto the plane. Judging eyes sweep over Evan, people looking at him as if he has walked into the wrong line. No suit, no expensive luggage, none of the symbols people expect from the so-called successful. A blonde woman stands near the boarding gate in a cream blazer, about 45 years old. Melissa Turner. Her face tight with irritation at not being prioritized. Her finger taps her phone repeatedly, as if counting impatient seconds. Evan glances at her but pays no attention. He has met hundreds of people like her, those who believe the world owes them something. First-class boarding is called. Evan steps forward with the group keeping his distance to avoid bumping into anyone. He hands his boarding pass to the agent. A green light, a soft beep, everything normal. Then he walks into the first-class cabin of Northern Sky Airlines, the place that in just moments will become a battlefield of prejudice, ego, and hidden power. Cool air from the vents sweeps over him as he moves toward the second row. 2A, he reminds himself. Window quiet, perfect. But when he turns down the aisle toward his row, his steps stop abruptly. An absurd sight unfolds before him. Seat 2. His seat is occupied. Melissa Turner, full make-up legs crossed, sparkling water in hand, sits there as if it were her living room. Her luxury handbag rests neatly beside her, and more than anything, her demeanor shows no trace of confusion. Evan pauses for a few seconds, not because he is shocked, but because he is analyzing what just happened. Melissa glances up, giving him a single look. That look is full of something familiar, judgment, dismissal, superiority. Then she returns to her phone, completely ignoring the man standing before her. Evan feels a tightness in his chest, not from anger, from the heavy familiarity of being seen as not enough, not polished enough, not wealthy enough, not powerful enough, a careless conclusion others believe they have the right to make. He inhales slowly and steps closer. "Excuse me," his voice gentle but clear. "Seat 2A is mine." Melissa does not look up immediately. The slow way she raises her face sends a message. "I've no reason to respect you." Then she gives a faint, condescending smile. "Are you sure this is my seat? I always sit here. You should double-check." Evan meets her cold eyes. "My boarding pass says 2A, he replies, holding on to the calm he has trained himself to maintain all his life. This is just a small moment, but Evan's instincts tell him this is the spark for something much larger, something no one in this first-class cabin expects. He does not know, and Melissa certainly does not know that in just a few minutes, the way they treat him now will shake the entire operational system of Northern Sky Airlines. Because Evan Brooks, the man they assume is just another ordinary passenger, holds enough power to stop the entire flight with a single sentence. And the next part of the story is only just beginning. The air in the first-class cabin suddenly thickened, not because of noise or chaos, but because of an uncomfortable silence, the kind that settles when someone is absolutely certain they are right, even when they are clearly wrong. Melissa Turner set her phone down, crossed her arms, carrying herself like someone who had won every argument simply through confidence and privilege. She looked at Evan as if he were a stranger who had wandered into a private lounge and dared to request her favorite seat. "Where is your boarding pass?" Her voice was as cold as glass struck by winter wind. Evan did not hurry. He took out his phone, opened his electronic ticket, and turned the screen toward her. Melissa glanced for barely half a second, just long enough to see the words right in front of her eyes. "Seat 2A, first-class passenger, Evan Brooks." But instead of acknowledging it, she pressed her lips together and tilted her head as if watching a comedy. "I think there is a mistake. I always sit in seat 2A on this Denver to Seattle route. The staff must have mixed things up." Evan felt a chill run down his spine, not from the air conditioning, from witnessing how people can build absurd beliefs just to avoid accepting the truth. He spoke slowly, clearly, every word deliberate. "Your ticket says 3C. Melissa let out a small laugh, half mocking, half pitying. "Young man, are you sure you are reading it correctly?" Evan was 38, not young at all. But to Melissa, anything that did not fit her template of rich and powerful automatically belonged to the group of people she deemed unworthy of attention. A man behind them, still loading his luggage into the overhead compartment, looked up. A woman in seat 1B raised an eyebrow. No one said a word, but their eyes all carried the same question. "Is he the one mistaken?" Evan tilted his head, patient, as though speaking to a stubborn child. You can open your boarding pass to confirm." Melissa sighed and lifted her phone with visible irritation. And then, the moment the screen lit up, Evan saw her eyes flicker. 3C. Middle seat. An undeniable truth. But Melissa Turner was not someone who accepted defeat simply because she was caught red-handed. A spark of pride flared in her gaze. "I am sure the staff printed the wrong seat for me," she said, her tone sharpening. "I always sit here." Evan said nothing. He simply stood there. But inside, a wave of fatigue passed through him. If he had not lived through dozens of moments like this throughout his life, he might have been angry. But he was used to it. Used to being underestimated because of his unremarkable appearance. Used to being asked to prove his worth in places where others only needed to show up. A sliver of memory flashed through his mind, a meeting when he was 26, when his teammate was introduced as the founder, and he was asked whose secretary he was. Those invisible scars sometimes hurt more in moments that seem small. Evan inhaled deeply. "Madam, I do not want to argue, but this seat is mine. Please cooperate." Melissa narrowed her eyes and lifted her lips into a disdainful smile. "There is a simpler solution. You sit in 3C. Problem solved. The cabin atmosphere cracked instantly. A whisper from the next seat, "Is she serious?" Another passenger shook their head. For a few seconds, Evan felt every gaze turn toward him, not to judge, but to see how he would respond. Before he could speak, a soft but weary voice appeared beside him. What seems to be the issue here? Flight attendant Lauren Miles arrived. 32 years old, oval face, hair tied neatly. A polite smile that suggested she had handled far too many problems in a single morning. Lauren looked at Evan, then at Melissa. "Is there an issue with the seat assignment?" Melissa jumped in immediately. "Yes. This man is trying to take my seat." Lauren turned to Evan and asked to see his ticket. He handed it over. She checked. She frowned, then nodded. "Mr. Brooks is correct. 2A is his seat." Lauren then turned to Melissa. "And your seat is 3C. One simple statement, one simple truth." But Melissa turned it into a battle. "No. I always sit in 2A. I am used to that spot. He can sit in 3C today. It is not a big deal." Evan felt heat rise along the back of his neck. Not anger, but weariness turning into a slow, burning flame. Lauren pressed her lips together, and that gesture told Evan that something was wrong. "Mr. Brooks." Lauren began her voice, slowing, choosing each word carefully. "To avoid delaying the flight, could you please temporarily sit in seat 3C? At that moment, Evan's heart sank a beat. This was no longer about a seat. This was about an entire lifetime. About how people like him were always the ones asked to step back so others could move forward. A passenger in seat 1C murmured softly, "This is not fair at all." A woman behind nodded. The flight attendant is clearly favoring her. The air grew heavy like a storm gathering. Evan looked at Lauren for a long moment, long enough to see hesitation, fear of responsibility, and a desire to avoid complications in her eyes. He spoke quietly but firmly. "I am not moving." The words were not loud, but they reached every corner of the cabin. Some people lifted their heads, some gripped their armrests, some exhaled as if finally someone had dared to stand up for them. Melissa's expression shifted from irritated to astonished. "You are causing trouble?" she whispered, her voice carrying a hint of threat. Evan replied calmly, "I am only asking for what I paid for." A long silence followed, and then, as with every tense moment on a plane, an unexpected arrival shifted everything. Lauren lifted her hand to the communication device on her collar. "Matt, can you come to the front for a moment? We have a situation." Evan looked up. He knew this was only the beginning. The real storm was still waiting. But he did not know. And Melissa certainly did not know that in just a few minutes they would be facing a man whose power was enough to stop the entire flight from taking off all because they misjudged one simple truth. Not everyone who looks ordinary is ordinary. Just as Lauren finished calling for assistance, the sound of steady footsteps echoed from the front of the cabin. Each step was firm, quick but dry, like a hammer knocking against a wooden door. Matt Harper, the first-class cabin supervisor, 40 years old, appeared with the gait of someone far too familiar with extinguishing problems before they became full-blown crises. Matt was nearly half a head taller than Evan. His shoulders were broad, his eyes sharp but impatient, the kind of person who judged the severity of trouble entirely by first impressions. And his first impression of Evan was clearly unfavorable, a plainly dressed man standing beside seat 2A, with the look of someone who did not fit the image of a VIP customer. Matt gave Evan exactly 1 second of attention before turning to Melissa with a cordial smile, as warm as sunshine, falling precisely on the person he wished to please. "Ma'am, is there an issue with your seat?" His voice was low, smooth, full of goodwill, but directed only toward Melissa. Melissa instantly shifted her expression, transforming from irritated to relieved, as though she had finally found the person who would fix everything exactly the way she wanted. "Yes," she said, raising her chin slightly. "This man is trying to take my seat. I told him I always sit in 2A. I think my ticket was printed incorrectly." Matt turned to Evan, eyebrows drawn together. "May I see your boarding pass?" Evan handed it over without another word. Matt checked it, frowned slightly, and released a quiet exhale. There was no denying it. 2A belonged to Evan. But instead of resolving the matter immediately, as any responsible employee should have done, Matt chose a different direction. The easier direction, the less confrontational direction, the wrong direction. He leaned closer to Evan, lowering his voice, as if offering a polite, gentlemanly compromise. "Mr. Brooks, to prevent the flight from being delayed, would you mind taking seat 3C for today, just this once?" In that moment, Evan saw clearly something he had always known. Fairness is respected only when it is convenient. When it becomes inconvenient, people bury it in silence. Melissa jumped in immediately, her voice carrying a hint of triumph. "You see, everyone agrees. There's no reason to make this a big deal." A few passengers began shaking their heads. A man whispered, "This is completely wrong." A woman in row 1 clenched her jaw. They're clearly showing favoritism. Lauren stood behind Matt, her expression clouded with unease. She knew Evan was right, knew Matt was handling this in a careless way, but she didn't have the courage to contradict her superior in a first-class cabin full of high-income customers. Matt placed his hand on the seat, as if signaling the end of all discussion. "Come on, Mr. Brooks. 3C is still in first class. You'll receive the same service." Evan lifted his gaze, showing no anger and no haste. He looked Matt directly in the eyes, and for a brief moment Matt seemed uncomfortable, as though he had realized those eyes did not belong to someone who could be pushed into doing something unreasonable. "No." Evan said, his voice low and sharp, like a blade slicing through soft fabric. "I will sit in the seat I paid for." The cabin air tightened instantly. Several passengers stopped tapping on their phones. The woman in 1B murmured, "Finally someone dares to speak up." In Melissa's eyes, disbelief shifted into anger. She glared at him. "Are you trying to cause trouble?" Evan turned toward her, his tone light, almost serene. "I am only asking for what is right." Matt's demeanor changed. He straightened his back, his voice stern. "You're affecting the schedule of the entire flight." Evan replied, "Me or her?" The simple question struck Matt like a slap. He had no response. Lauren tightened her hands, a small gesture that revealed she knew exactly who was right and who was wrong. Melissa exhaled sharply. "I don't believe the airline would make a loyal customer like me sit in a middle seat while this person demands special treatment. This person." Those two words hit Evan harder than any insult. He had heard them his entire life, in boardrooms, in pitch meetings, and in forced polite praise from investors. This person always meant he was not the kind of person they expected. Evan pressed his lips together. He did not move. He did not need to say anything more. Because at that moment, as if fate intended to tear open the entire situation, a passenger in row 3 spoke loudly enough for the whole cabin to hear. Everyone saw his ticket says 2A. "So why should he move?" Someone in row 1 added. "They're treating him disrespectfully." A wave of murmurs rose. Another wave more dangerous began rising inside Matt, a mix of lost control, fear of being judged by passengers, and anger toward Evan, the man refusing to cooperate. Matt raised his intercom. "Call Captain Reynolds to the front of the cabin. We have a situation." Melissa smirked, convinced she was moments away from being vindicated. Lauren turned her face away, unable to look at Evan, because his eyes made her feel guilty. Passengers grew restless, some even excited by the escalating drama. Evan remained still, his breathing slow, his eyes darkening. His calm was not surrender. It was a preparation for something he knew was coming. Truth cannot be avoided for long, and real power never announces itself loudly. In just a few seconds, everyone here would begin to realize they had misjudged the man standing before them. Misjudged him terribly. The cockpit door latch clicked open. A deep, gravelly voice sounded. "What's going on here?" Captain Harris Reynolds stepped out, and the storm officially began. The cockpit door opened with a small sound, but its impact was unmistakable. The entire first-class cabin fell instantly silent. Captain Harris Reynolds, a man in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair and eyes sharp as a blade, stepped forward like a judge summoned to resolve a case in which no one wished to be caught on the wrong side. Evan looked up, not avoiding his gaze. Melissa straightened, immediately adjusted her cream blazer, and posed like someone feeling inconvenienced. Matt inhaled deeply, aware he could no longer ignore or compromise his way out of this. Captain Reynolds stopped at row 2, his hands clasped behind his back, standing with the composure of someone who had handled dozens of tense situations in the sky, yet had never encountered one quite like this. "Explain to me what is happening." His voice was low, calm, but carried enough weight to make even the people recording pause for a moment. Matt stepped forward. "Captain, this passenger," he pointed at Evan, "is refusing to move to another seat, so we can resolve what appears to be a seat assignment mix-up." "A seat mix-up," Captain Reynolds repeated, looking directly at Matt. He did not ask the question twice. He just looked, and Matt began to sweat lightly. Melissa jumped in, more eager than anyone. "Yes, exactly. I always sit in 2A. I already told them. My ticket must have been printed wrong." And she shot Evan a triumphant look. This man is making everything more complicated. Captain Reynolds shifted his attention to Evan, as if reading the truth through the calmness in his expression. "Do you have your ticket?" Evan lifted his phone, steady and unhurried. The captain looked for exactly 1 second, then nodded. 2A. Correct? He turned to Melissa, his voice unchanged. And your ticket, Melissa, held out her phone display, trying to look composed, though her hand trembled slightly. Reynolds examined it. 2 seconds of silence. Then he spoke 3 words, cool and precise as a cold blade. 3C, row 3. A simple statement, yet powerful enough to make the entire first-class cabin shift uneasily. Melissa's face went pale, then flushed red, then a faint purplish hue like someone splashed with cold water. But she still refused to yield. Captain, I think the airline system made a mistake. I have been sitting in that seat for years. Anyone who knows me knows that. This is clearly a misunderstanding. Reynolds kept his tone even, but his eyes sharpened. Mrs. Turner, the airline system shows you booked seat 3C. There is no error in your reservation. How can you be sure Melissa snapped hands on hips? You only check the ticket. You do not have access to the entire I am the captain. Reynolds interrupted. I have access to the full manifest booking information and internal notes. I reviewed the system before stepping out here. A clean, decisive blow. Precise. Leaving no room for Melissa to escape. Her mouth opened, then closed. No argument left. Reynolds turned to Matt. Mr. Harper, why was the passenger with the correct seat assignment asked to move? The simple question hit Matt like a thunderbolt. He stammered. Captain, I only wanted to keep the departure on schedule. I thought it might be easier for everyone. A woman in row 1 exclaimed, It is not easier at all. This is favoritism. Evan remained silent, eyes on the captain. He knew this was not just about him. This was about how the system treated people it believed did not look the part. Reynolds turned to Lauren, and Lauren, lowered her head. Captain, I confirm seat 2. A belongs to Mr. Brooks. But when the other passenger refused to move, I suggested he switch to 3C. Captain Reynolds frowned, his eyes narrowing. Why would you do that? Lauren swallowed hard. I was afraid it would escalate. I genuinely wanted to avoid delaying the flight. Evan watched her, sensing sincerity mixed with pressure. She was wrong, but not malicious. Just afraid. Matt, however, was different. He pushed the blame. Mr. Brooks refused to cooperate. He could sit in any first-class seat. There is no difference. That was when Evan spoke, his voice low calm but sharper than a blade. There is a difference. He looked directly at Matt. The difference is I paid for 2A, and she did not. The air froze. Even those recording forgot to tap their screens for a heartbeat. Reynolds looked at Matt. His expression said clearly, You just lost this argument. Before Matt could respond, Melissa cut in again, desperate, her voice turning sharp. I am a loyal customer of this airline. I fly this route every month. You cannot expect me to sit in a middle seat. Captain Reynolds turned toward her, his tone no longer gentle. Mrs. Turner, in every situation, passengers sit in the seat they paid for. There are no exceptions. Melissa clenched her teeth. But I am used to sitting in 2A. Reynolds let out a long sigh, the weary sigh of a man who had dealt with far too many passengers like her. And I am used to taking off on time. But sometimes we must accept reality. A passenger laughed quietly. Whispered approval rippled through the cabin. Melissa's face burned with embarrassment. She looked around, searching for someone to side with her. No one. And Evan sensed something shift in the air. A subtle but unmistakable change. The cabin was now on his side. Reynolds stepped aside and gestured. "Mrs. Turner, please move to row 3. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds." Melissa stood her hands, trembling with fury. She hissed under her breath. "You will be responsible for this," Reynolds replied without blinking. "My pleasure." The cabin erupted in soft laughter and murmurs of satisfaction. Melissa walked past Evan, eyes full of venom. Evan said nothing. He simply sat down in seat 2A, his rightful seat, with the composure of someone who knew this battle was only the beginning. Captain Reynolds turned to Evan. "We apologize for the inconvenience, Mr. Brooks. This situation should never have escalated this far." Evan met his eyes. "Thank you. But this is not just an inconvenience." Reynolds understood, and he knew Evan was right. At the far end of the first-class cabin, several phones were still recording. This story would not end on this plane. It would spread. And when Evan's true power emerged, Northern Sky Airlines would face a reckoning they never saw coming. Melissa was forced to move to row 3, but the tension did not fade. The sighs, the whispers, the clicking of phones, still recording all of it, blended into a charged atmosphere, stretched thin like a tightened string. Everyone assumed the situation was over. But what happened in the next 30 seconds would prove that this was only the calm before the storm. Evan sat down, in seat 2A, resting his hand on the armrest. Not in a victorious pose, not in arrogance, but in calmness. A dangerous kind of calmness, the calmness of someone who had endured injustice all his life and had no intention of backing down. Captain Reynolds turned to return to the cockpit when a small voice rose from behind. "Captain, I believe we still have a problem." The voice belonged to Matt Harper. Evan opened his eyes. Reynolds stopped mid-step. The entire first-class cabin turned toward Matt, as if he had just cocked a loaded gun in an enclosed room. Matt wet his lips, trying to appear composed, though his eyes betrayed bitterness. He had been embarrassed by Evan in front of all the passengers, and some people never accept losing. "Mr. Brooks," Matt said, his voice slicing through the air like a thin blade. "Even though your seat is 2A, the way you behaved may cause difficulties for the flight. I must consider whether you should continue this journey." A chill swept through the cabin. Passengers nearby turned toward Evan, waiting to see what he would do. Lauren's eyes widened, genuine shock spreading across her face. "Matt, what are you doing?" she whispered. But Matt had already crossed a line. He could not take it back. Reynolds spun around, his expression darkening. "Harper, I have already resolved this." But Matt jabbed a finger at Evan, hatred simmering beneath his words, refused to cooperate multiple times. That can be considered interfering with crew operations. Someone in row 1 exclaimed, "He only defended his seat." "How is that interfering?" Another voice rose louder. "Leave the man alone." Phones lifted higher, capturing Matt's face, and every word leaving his mouth. Lauren whispered with trembling breath. "Matt, stop. You are destroying yourself," Melissa shouted from row 3. "Exactly. He caused trouble. I said it from the beginning." Every passenger turned toward her with looks of disgust. And Evan, he simply breathed, slow and deep, very deep. He had endured these moments all his life, but today, in front of so many witnesses, in front of a system accustomed to covering itself in front of people, so quick to enable unfairness, he sensed a line he could no longer allow anyone to cross. Captain Reynolds was losing patience. Mr. Harper, his voice was not loud, but was sharp enough to feel like a death sentence. "If you keep escalating this, I will file an internal report. The passenger is not causing a disturbance. He refused to be treated unfairly. Matt swallowed hard. But instead of backing down, he made the worst possible choice. If he is really an important passenger, Matt said loudly, then why is there no note in the system about his priority level? No service tag, no special record. He is just an ordinary customer. A silence fell across the cabin like a blade slicing through air. A chilling stillness radiated from seat 2A. Evan opened his eyes and looked directly at Matt. Calm, not angry, not shaken. Only one thing gleamed in his gaze: resolve. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stood up slowly. The entire cabin fell silent, as if waiting to hear a pin drop. Evan looked around at every passenger, every phone recording him at Lauren, whose worry had turned into fear, at Captain Reynolds, who was holding on to composure with difficulty, and finally at Matt, who was trembling slightly, because he didn't know what was coming. Evan spoke, his voice soft as a breeze, but each word striking like a stone. You want to know who I am? Very well. Matt stepped back half a pace. Evan slowly took out his phone, opened a document, and turned the screen toward Captain Reynolds. On it was the shareholder registry of Northern Sky Airlines, and the name listed under major investors holding a significant percentage of shares was Evan Brooks. A flash of realization exploded across every face in the cabin. Lauren brought a hand to her mouth, nearly dropping her notebook. Captain Reynolds's eyes widened in disbelief. Melissa in row 3 choked on her own breath. Passengers stared, eyes round, some nearly dropping their phones. And Matt, he stepped back again, his mouth opening, but no sound emerging. Evan continued, still calm, but with steel in his tone. I do not need priority notes. I do not need service tags. I do not need anyone to recognize me. He lowered the phone. I only need to be treated correctly, just like any other passenger. The words fell like a hammer against the pillars of the airline's dignity. The cabin erupted in applause. Not loud applause, but firm, unwavering, supportive, the applause of people who had seen or experienced what it felt like to be dismissed or belittled. Captain Reynolds took a step toward Evan, his voice low and sincere. On behalf of the airline, I apologize. Evan shook his head gently. No need to apologize yet. There is still something that must be done. Matt's voice cracked. W, what do you want? Evan looked straight into his eyes. Call ground management, right now. Matt went pale. Reynolds immediately made the call through the intercom, and exactly 2 minutes later, the cabin door clicked open. 2 senior ground managers stepped into first class, and that was only the beginning of the earthquake, about to crash down on the entire crew. The aircraft cabin door opened without a noise, but the way the 2 figures stepped inside sent a cold draft sweeping through the entire first-class cabin. They did not carry the frantic energy of flight attendants, nor the nervousness of staff summoned abruptly. They carried authority, a level of authority completely out of sync with the chaos that had unfolded moments earlier. Angela Ruiz, 42 years old, Director of Ground Operations at Denver International Airport. Compact build, sharp eyes, posture straight like forged steel. Walking beside her was Derek Vaughan, 39 years old, passenger services manager, tall, composed, holding his tablet like a weapon. Together they entered the cabin, as if stepping into an emergency boardroom meeting, not a flight preparing for departure. The passengers fell silent instantly. This was the moment everyone understood the situation had gone beyond the crew's control. It had escalated to a higher level of intervention. Angela stopped at the first row, her gaze sweeping across the cabin, registering every detail, every expression, every phone recording the scene. Her face did not change, but Evan, observing her movements carefully, understood immediately that she grasped the entire situation in just a few seconds. "Good afternoon," Angela said, her voice crisp, clear, and professionally cold. "We were informed of an issue involving seating and the conduct between passengers and crew." No one answered. The air grew heavier, waiting. Angela turned to Captain Reynolds. "Captain Reynolds, brief report." Reynolds exhaled. A passenger was in the wrong seat. "We confirmed that seat 2A belongs to Mr. Brooks, but the situation was prolonged unnecessarily." Angela nodded, once then directed her gaze toward Melissa Turner, who was curled up in row 3 like a student called to the front of the class. "Mrs. Turner," Angela said, her tone offering no comfort. "Your ticket, please." Melissa tried to remain composed, but her hands visibly trembled as she raised her phone. Angela looked at it for exactly 1 second. 3C. She lifted her head, her voice metallic and sharp. "There is no error. You were sitting in the wrong seat." The blunt truth hit so directly that Melissa nearly choked on air. A few passengers even muttered a soft, "My goodness." Then Angela did something no one expected. She turned to the crew. "Your turn, Mr. Harper," she said to Matt. "Explain why you instructed the correct passenger to switch seats." Matt opened his mouth. No sound came out. Angela was not impatient. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze cold enough to melt ice slowly. "Mr. Harper, I am waiting." Matt swallowed hard, scrambling for words. I only wanted to keep the flight on schedule. And passenger Brooks refused to cooperate." Evan remained still, eyes fixed on Angela. Angela turned to Derek. "Check the system logs." Derek swiped across his tablet, the blue glow lighting his face. 1 second. 2 seconds. Derek raised an eyebrow. "System notes show that Mr. Brooks presented the correct ticket. There is no record of non-compliance. In fact, it shows the passenger in row 3 refused to follow instructions." The cabin collectively turned toward Melissa. Shame blazed bright across her face. Angela continued. "And there is also this." She lowered the tablet just enough for Matt and Lauren to see. On the screen was a line of text highlighted in orange, the line no crew member ever wanted to see associated with their name. "Crew discretion error. Possible bias handling." Lauren covered her mouth, her face drained of color. Matt froze completely. No one spoke. No one breathed. No one dared look directly at Evan. Angela took a deep breath and turned to Evan, her tone shifting to respectful professionalism. "Mr. Brooks, we have reviewed your customer profile." Matt flinched slightly. "You are a diamond-tier priority passenger." And Angela glanced toward Derek. Derek nodded, switched to another screen, and read aloud for the entire cabin to hear. "And Mr. Brooks is also one of the strategic investors of Northern Sky Airlines." A wave of gasps erupted through the cabin like fireworks. A man whispered, "No way," while the woman in row 1 nearly dropped her phone into her lap. Lauren stood frozen. Captain Reynolds finally understood why he had sensed there was something about this man that should never be underestimated. As for Matt, he nearly collapsed where he stood. Angela continued, her voice low but heavy. "This means all interactions with Mr. Brooks must meet the highest standard. And I'm afraid our crew has failed at every step." Lauren stepped back, her eyes reddening. Matt tried to swallow, but failed. Derek straightened as if awaiting disciplinary instructions. Angela turned toward the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Northern Sky Airlines, we apologize for the inconvenience. The airline will address this matter seriously and transparently." Then she faced Matt directly. Mr. Harper, you are relieved of duty immediately. Leave the aircraft? A stunned "oh" echoed somewhere in the cabin. Melissa nearly jumped to her feet, expecting support, but Angela fixed her eyes on her and said, "And Mrs. Turner, if you do not return to seat 3C right now, we will ask you to leave the aircraft." The atmosphere flipped instantly. There was no more politeness. Some passengers snickered. Some clapped. Someone whispered, "Serves her right." Melissa trembled, her lips pressed tightly together. She lowered her head and quietly returned to her seat, stripped of every bit of arrogance. Only then did Angela turn to Evan. "Mr. Brooks, on behalf of the airline, we sincerely apologize." Evan looked at her, not angry, but disappointed. A disappointment not directed at one person, but at an entire system. Yet he answered in a calm, steady tone, "I do not need an apology yet. I just need to know this will not happen again." Angela nodded. "I assure you, this will be reported directly to the executive board." Angela knew very well that this situation would not end inside this aircraft. With Evan Brooks's position and influence, everything would be re-evaluated from the ground up. Evan sat back in seat 2A, but this time the entire cabin no longer saw him as an ordinary man. They saw him as someone who had just shifted the trajectory of an entire airline with a single conversation. And this was still only the opening act. If anyone in the first-class cabin thought that Angela's appearance, Matt's suspension, and Melissa being sent back to her correct seat marked the end of the story, they were wrong. Very wrong. Because when Evan Brooks sat back down in seat 2, he fastened his seatbelt and leaned his head against the seat back. That was not a signal of satisfaction. It was the signal that he was preparing to make a decision. A decision that would keep this entire Boeing 737 from moving an inch. Not because of technical issues, not because of weather, but because of a single sentence spoken by the man they had all misjudged for the past 20 minutes. Evan closed his eyes, a slow breath, but in his mind, a cascade of old images surged forward, like a film reel being fast-forwarded the meeting rooms where people asked him who he was representing, the times security stopped him at VIP counters because he dressed simply the skeptical looks when he stood next to other CEOs, simply because he didn't match the expected image of power. And now Matt Harper, Melissa Turner, and an entire system ready to push him into another seat to avoid inconvenience. No, today would not be like any day before. The announcement tone rang out. "Cabin crew prepare for departure." Lauren walked briskly down the aisle, checking seatbelts. She was still pale after the shock Angela brought. She stopped at row 2, opened her mouth, as if to say something, but froze when Evan opened his eyes. His eyes were no longer gentle. They held the sharp clarity of someone ready to change an entire system. Lauren tensed. She felt fear. Evan slowly turned his head toward Captain Reynolds, who was standing near the middle of the cabin, reviewing Angela's final report. And Evan spoke. One sentence. Simple. Low and sharp. "This flight is not going anywhere." The voice was quiet, yet somehow it echoed across the cabin, as if amplified. Reynolds spun around. "What did you say?" Evan rose from his seat. Not in anger, not in intimidation. Simply stating truth. "I said this aircraft will not leave the gate." "Not now?" A passenger gasped. Another placed a hand over his chest as if choking on disbelief. Melissa in row 3 snapped her head up her face, turning pale. Reynolds stepped closer, his voice dropping. "Mr. Brooks, we already resolved the issue. Everything." "No, Evan, cut him off. Nothing has been resolved. You only scrubbed the surface." Matt, standing at the door waiting for ground staff to escort him away, felt ice crawl down his neck. Derek stood motionless, watching Evan with a knowing heaviness in his eyes, understanding that what was coming could not be undone. Evan looked directly at Captain Reynolds, his voice measured. "I will not allow this flight to depart until the airline files an official report, brings in senior management, and handles every person involved according to proper procedures. Not temporary suspension, not verbal apologies. I want the internal process executed correctly." A shockwave rippled down the cabin. A man whispered, "He's stopping the flight." A woman leaned toward her friend. Does he even have the authority to do that? Evan heard all of it, and he decided to answer without being asked. He turned, letting the entire cabin see him clearly. "This is not about me being in the wrong seat. This is not about a misprinted ticket. This is not a trivial issue." He pointed toward row 3, where Melissa was shrinking into herself. "This is about how people think they are entitled to more than others." He pointed at Matt. "About an employee using authority to remove inconvenience regardless of what is right." Then he looked across the entire cabin, and about a system that easily shifts blame onto whoever looks like they have less power. Every word landed deep in the passengers' minds. Someone in the back spoke loudly. "He is right. Completely right," another woman added. "They always do this. Push the blame on whoever they think is weaker." Reynolds did not interrupt, did not defend, because Evan had spoken nothing but truth. Evan continued, lowering his voice, yet every syllable grew heavier. "Captain, I cannot sit quietly and fly knowing this could happen again to the next person. A woman, an elderly passenger, a young man of color, someone without the means to stand up like I can." He took one step forward. "I demand that the airline begins the disciplinary process right here at the gate, in front of passengers, in front of cameras, in front of the truth." Angela, standing near the cabin entrance, bit her lip. She understood that what Evan wanted was not privilege, it was accountability. Reynolds looked at Angela, silently asking for guidance. Angela gave a small nod. Reynolds inhaled deeply. "Very well," he said, his voice like wind scraping across glass. Then he lifted his radio. "Tower, this is Flight 291. We need to hold at the gate. Departure delayed until further notice." The passengers froze. Melissa dropped her phone. Matt clutched the doorway as if he might faint, and Evan simply said, "Thank you." In that moment, he was no longer a man in a blue polo. He stood like a symbol, a reminder that sometimes one person refusing to bow to injustice forces the entire world to stop and look at itself. The intercom crackled with the tower's reply. Flight 291 understood. Holding position. The flight was officially grounded, not because of aircraft failure, not because of storms, not because of missing crew, but because one man refused to step back. Evan sat down again, his heartbeat steady, his expression calm. But the entire Northern Sky Airlines had begun to tremble. The Boeing 737 sat frozen at the gate like a giant beast with its legs bound. The engines were silent, the doors still open, and the eyes of more than 100 passengers were fixed on row 2A, where Evan Brooks sat calmly, as if he were the only person untouched by the storm swallowing the aircraft. Phones rang across the cabin. Live streams went live. Tense whispers sliced the air like thin blades. This is big. The airline must be panicking right now. Is he really a shareholder? What kind of shareholder can stop a plane? In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds was speaking rapidly with the control tower and operations center. Angela Ruiz stood beside him, watching the communication screen with cold, focused intensity. But the person under the most pressure was Matt Harper. He stood by the cabin door like a shadow being scorched. Sweat trickled down his neck. Every time a phone lifted to record him, he turned away. For the first time in his career, he felt fear, a fear so sharp, his hands no longer obeyed him. Angela stepped toward him, her voice low but cutting. They are reviewing every second of footage from boarding until now. Matt's throat tightened. And when the board sees the part where you pressured the correct passenger to give up his seat, Angela tilted her head slightly. I do not think your career will have an exit path. Matt closed his eyes. The image of decades of work collapsed like a waterfall over him. Meanwhile, Evan remained still. Not angry, not triumphant, just quiet. A quiet so heavy that anyone who looked at him understood he had no intention of letting this incident be swept under the carpet of internal mistakes. Lauren approached him. She leaned down, her voice small and trembling. Would you like some water? Evan opened his eyes. Not cold, not accusatory. No, thank you. A soft reply, yet Lauren felt her skin burn, because in that voice there was no anger, only disappointment, and that was harder to bear. She turned away, her eyes wet. A soft ping echoed from the intercom. Angela raised her hand for silence. Denver operations to Flight 291. The electronic voice announced sharp and clear. We have the full situation. Hold the aircraft at the gate. A senior representative is being dispatched for an in-person meeting with the involved passenger. Reynolds answered. Confirmed. Whispers rippled through the cabin. A meeting on the plane. Who is the senior representative? This is getting out of hand. They had no idea the next part would be even bigger. 3 minutes later, only 3 minutes, the aircraft door opened again, and a man in a deep blue suit stepped in. Tall, rigid posture, a face carved like polished stone eyes, as sharp as steel forged through tens of thousands of decisions. Jonathan Hale, Executive Vice President of Northern Sky Airlines. In the American aviation industry, his name was known by everyone, and the fact that he appeared on the aircraft within minutes meant only one thing. The airline was in full panic. Jonathan did not look at anyone except Evan. He walked straight to row 2 and stopped in front of him. Mr. Brooks. His voice was deep-weighted. I am Jonathan Hale. I am here to address this immediately. The entire cabin went dead silent. Even breaths seemed to stop. Evan nodded slightly. Jonathan lowered his voice, though loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. Our airline has made a serious mistake. I take full responsibility. I want to hear directly from you. What do you need? This was no longer an apology. This was negotiation. Angela stood behind Jonathan, watching Evan with a mix of respect and uncertainty. Derek Vaughan was poised to begin an official report. Reynolds stood at attention like a disciplined soldier. And Matt was unraveling. He understood that with one sentence from Evan, his career would vanish from the aviation map. A few seconds of silence. Evan did not stand. He remained seated as a man firmly in the place he chose, with no need to yield, no need to ask permission, no tremor in his posture. He said, I do not need compensation. I do not need upgrades. I do not need gifts. Jonathan frowned. Then what do you need? Evan looked straight into his eyes, a calm, profound gaze that seemed to freeze the entire cabin. "I need structure." He spoke slowly, evenly. "I need change. I need your people to understand that avoiding inconvenience can never be more important than respecting human beings." Jonathan pressed his lips, his eyes softening with a hint of realization. Evan continued, "I want the entire incident documented. I want training protocols re-evaluated. I want an official communication from the airline not to name or shame anyone, but to ensure the next person is not treated the way I was." A few passengers wiped their eyes, not from sadness, but from resonance. Then Evan said the sentence that detonated everything, "And I want accountability. Right here. Right now." Jonathan looked at him for a long moment, and then he nodded, a heavy oath-like nod. "Very well. We will do it now." He turned to Matt. "Mr. Harper, effective immediately, you are suspended from all duties. The investigation process will begin within 24 hours. You must leave the aircraft." Matt staggered away, stripped of all authority. Jonathan turned to Lauren. She nearly broke into tears. "Ms. Miles, the company, will review your role and level of involvement, but because you attempted to correct the situation afterward, you may remain on this flight until the investigation concludes." Lauren nodded, tears flowing down her cheeks. Finally, he turned to Melissa Turner. She sat frozen like a statue, face pale. Jonathan spoke each word clearly. "Mrs. Turner, the airline will record your violation of seating regulations and your refusal to cooperate. You may continue the flight, but you will be placed on the passenger watch list." Melissa opened her mouth to protest, but Jonathan cut her off. No discussion, and she lowered her head for the first time since boarding, completely silent. Jonathan turned back to Evan. "Mr. Brooks, with one word from you, this flight will depart. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds." Evan inhaled softly and looked around the cabin at the watching eyes, the tense faces, the people who saw their own experiences reflected in this moment. Then he said, "Let them depart." Jonathan nodded firmly, and for the first time since the beginning of the ordeal, the entire first-class cabin erupted into applause. Not because the airline acted, not because Matt was suspended, but because they had witnessed something rare. A man refusing to bow to injustice and making an entire system bow before his integrity. When Jonathan Hale stepped off the aircraft, the cabin door closed with a soft click, but for everyone on Flight 291, it was the sound of a new chapter beginning. A chapter they would never forget, one they would retell decades from now, whenever someone asked, "Have you ever witnessed justice unfold right before your eyes?" First class fell quieter than usual. No more grumbling, no more judgmental stares, no more tension stretched tight like wire. Instead came a rare kind of silence, the silence of respect, understanding, and awakening. Lauren walked down the aisle checking seat belts. Each step carried the weight of a difficult lesson. When she reached seat 2A, she paused. Evan still sat there, calm as if the storm that had ripped through the aircraft had nothing to do with him. But Lauren knew that was not true. No one remained this composed unless they had endured too much and decided they would endure no more. "Mr. Brooks," her voice trembled. "I really am sorry." Evan tilted his head, looking at her. Not with blame, not with coldness, but with the understanding of someone who recognized human frailty. "Ms. Miles, I am not angry at you." Evan spoke softly, but Lauren heard every word. "I am angry at the way we are taught to avoid trouble instead of confronting the truth." Lauren bit her lip eyes, reddening. For the first time in years of service, she felt ashamed of herself. "Thank you," was all she managed. She walked away, swallowing the tightness in her throat. Captain Reynolds spoke over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, brace for departure. Thank you for your patience." His voice no longer carried only the authority of a commander. It carried the weight of a man who had just witnessed a lesson worth more than any training manual, worth more than any customer service workshop, taught not by a corporate instructor, but by a man in a deep blue polo shirt who had been dismissed for the first 20 minutes of the flight. The aircraft began to taxi. Passengers looked out the windows, though many kept glancing toward row 2, unable to take their eyes off the real-life protagonist of a story they had just watched unfold, live, unedited, unrehearsed. A man in row 1 turned and smiled. "You did the right thing. Thank you." Evan simply nodded, though something deeper shimmered in his gaze. He had not done this for gratitude. He did it because of not him. Then who? As the plane lifted off the ground, that familiar, weightless sensation filled the cabin. But this time, the weightlessness was not just physical. It was the shedding of prejudice that had been pulled down from the sky. The engines roared, pushing the aircraft into a silver sheet of thin clouds. The blue sky opened ahead like a clean page, one that every passenger silently began rewriting in their own way. Evan looked out the window. The snowy mountains below shrank like distant memories. In that moment, he realized the most frightening thing was not injustice itself. It was how easily people accepted it, treated it as an ordinary part of life. For years, he had told himself he could ignore it for the sake of temporary peace. But today, standing before the cabin, before the eyes of the system, and dozens of witnesses, he understood silence was also a form of complicity. In row 3, C. Melissa Turner sat motionless. She stared into the empty space before her, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles turned white. No more arrogance. No more "I deserve more." Only confrontation with herself. She had heard every word Evan spoke when he addressed the leadership. The sentence, "I only want to be treated like every other passenger," struck her pride like a blade. Melissa had never believed she was a bad person, but sometimes bad people were not the ones who intended harm. Bad people were simply those so accustomed to privilege that they no longer saw right from wrong. A tear slid down her cheek. No one saw it. No one knew. And no one was obligated to comfort her. Passengers continued whispering, but their voices were softer now. This will be everywhere online. I hope the airline truly changes. He really is powerful. But he used his power the right way. A middle-aged woman murmured to her husband, "If it were me in that situation, I would have stayed quiet." "I am not strong enough." Her husband smiled gently. "Not everyone is. But sometimes one person is enough." Evan leaned his head back and closed his eyes. Not to sleep, but to finally relax after a confrontation that felt endless. He did not feel victorious. He did not feel proud. He felt sad. Sad that something as small as a seat could expose the fragility of human behavior. Sad that so many people would never dare say what he said. Sad because he knew this was not the first time, and rarely would it be the last. But then Jonathan Hale's voice echoed in his memory. You only needed to say one sentence. Today Evan had said that sentence. And he had said it at exactly the right moment. As the aircraft pierced through a thick layer of clouds, white light flooded the cabin, washing Evan's face in a warm glow. The people who witnessed today, whether cabin crew passengers or even Melissa, would carry this story for years, because not everyone in their lifetime gets to see an ordinary man stand up and make an entire system bow. The aircraft leveled off at cruising altitude. The cabin returned to its gentle rhythm. But beneath that calm, one truth spread quietly through everyone aboard. This airline would never be the same again. And neither would they. The aircraft broke through the white clouds and continued its journey toward Seattle, but in the hearts of the passengers that flight had already changed course long ago. No one was thinking about work vacations or the destination anymore. They were thinking about the man in row 2, the man who had made them look at themselves differently. Evan Brooks closed his eyes, not out of exhaustion, but because he finally had a moment of true quiet. In that silence, he felt the emotions of everyone around him. Soft voices from nearby seats, gentle sighs, the faint click of seatbelts, all reflecting one undeniable truth they were changing. A man who had been dismissed had awakened more than 100 people. About an hour later, when the cabin settled, Lauren approached with a white envelope. She hesitated for a second before speaking. "Mr. Brooks, this is an official apology letter from the airline. Jonathan wanted you to have it right away." Evan accepted the envelope but did not open it. "It is not as important as what they choose to do next," he said softly. Lauren lowered her head, not from pressure this time, but from genuine respect. "I promise you, I will never ignore injustice again." Evan looked at her with a gentle but steady gaze. "We have all been silent at some point. What matters is when we choose to start speaking up." Lauren smiled faintly, the first smile she had shown since the beginning of the flight. In row 3, Melissa Turner curled into herself like a wilted leaf. She did not dare look at anyone. She did not dare speak. She did not even dare breathe too loudly. Her arrogance had dissolved completely, leaving behind a hollow heaviness inside her chest. She replayed Evan's words in her mind. She remembered the disappointment in his eyes, not anger. She remembered the way the entire cabin reacted when the truth came to light. She had believed she was the victim of a mistake, but the truth was harsher. She had fallen victim to her own entitlement. A tear slid down her cheek, not because she had been humiliated, but because for the first time she saw herself in a mirror that was anything but flattering. The aircraft drifted quietly above the clouds. Passengers still glanced toward Evan every now and then, as if he were the center of a social structure that had cracked open right there in the cabin. A middle-aged woman in the row ahead looked back. "Mr. Brooks, thank you. You did not fight just for yourself. You fought for all of us." Evan only offered a faint smile, enough to show he understood, but he did not need praise. A young student behind him spoke up. "If something like that happened to me, I would have stayed quiet. Because of you, I want to be stronger." A salt-and-pepper-haired man nodded. Things like this happen every day, but few people dare to stand up. Evan did not respond. He did not want to be a hero. He wanted to be a symbol of what is right. As the aircraft began its descent, golden sunlight washed over the mountaintops and shimmering rivers below. A familiar ding echoed through the cabin. Reynolds spoke over the intercom. "We are preparing to land in Seattle. Thank you for your patience." His voice was deep and humble. Not the humility of someone doing a job, but the humility of someone who had learned something larger than himself. When the wheels touched down on the runway, the loud screech felt less like a harsh sound and more like a closing chapter of darkness for the airline. The cabin erupted in applause, sincere applause that lasted longer than usual, No one was applauding the safe landing. They were applauding the truth, applauding the man who refused to let the truth be buried. Evan opened his eyes and stood once the aircraft stopped completely. He did not rush. He gathered his belongings and pulled his suitcase down like any ordinary passenger. A man placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Thank you. You reminded us of something many people forget. Dignity can be attacked, but it must never be surrendered." Evan simply nodded. As he walked off the aircraft, dozens of eyes followed him. Not with admiration, not with curiosity, but with gratitude. At the door, Jonathan Hale was waiting. He stepped forward. "Mr. Brooks, I want to reaffirm that what happened today will not be buried. I will personally oversee every adjustment in training and procedure." Evan looked at him with unwavering eyes. "Do it not for me, but for those who do not have a voice as strong as mine." Jonathan placed a hand over his chest, a rare gesture from someone as stern as him. "I give you my word." Then they parted ways. No dramatic handshake, no theatrics, just two men who understood their responsibilities. Outside the airport, the Seattle breeze touched Evan's face with a cold whisper. He stopped and took a deep breath, feeling the freedom he had reclaimed, not for himself alone, but for everyone who would board a plane after this day. Evan pulled out his phone, opened a new email, and typed only one line. "We need to talk about internal culture." He sent it to the board of directors. Not to complain, not to seek justice only for himself, but to help build a system where injustice has no place to survive. Evan Brooks walked out of the terminal, blending into the crowd. He looked just as ordinary as he had that morning. No spotlight, no display of power. But to those who witnessed what happened, he would never be ordinary again. Because sometimes a seat is not just a place to sit. It is the line between being dismissed and standing up for dignity. And today, in the middle of that noisy sky, Evan reminded the world of something they had forgotten. Dignity is never negotiable, and respect is never optional. It is a duty. Evan reminded us of a truth that seems simple, but is often forgotten in crowded high-pressure spaces, the truth that human dignity must never be traded for convenience. Social psychology experts call this the normalization of injustice, when people repeat a wrongful behavior so many times that it begins to feel insignificant. But the moment one person decides to stand tall, the entire flawed structure is forced to confront itself. If this story resonates with you, please like and subscribe to follow more journeys that speak up for fairness. And before you leave the video, leave a short comment. Keep your dignity.